Greetings, carbon-based life forms and other beings that may or may not exist. It is I. Today I'm going to be talking about what makes a good final boss. This is a topic I've seen discussed in some places, but I've only seen a couple videos addressing the topic. Plus I've been thinking about it quite a bit recently, and I figured I'd share my thoughts and findings with all of you. Also, I'm going to be using this video to create a criteria for my next video, in 2028, which will be ranking the final bosses of every game I've played, unless I get lazy and make it only some of them, which is bound to happen. Before I begin, I think I should get the obvious out of the way. There will be spoilers for the final bosses of the games you can see on the screen right now. Each section I talk about will list the games which will be spoiled in that section. That way you can watch this video relatively spoiler-free. Also, please remember that this is all just my opinion. If you disagree with anything I say in this video, just let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And without further ado, let's look at some bosses. On screen now, you can see the quick list that I've created that I'm going to be using in this video. I'm going to talk about each section in depth, starting with the general mood. For this section, I'm going to be talking about the music, the arena, and the background. In general, the mood should always have a very epic tone. It should give you the feeling that you've come a long way and you are now finally at the end of your journey. This is the moment the whole game has been leading up to, and this is the final climax. There are a couple things that need to happen in order for this to be achieved. First of all, the music. The music of the final boss should be a very epic song. It should give off a feeling I just described, as the music sets the mood throughout the entire fight. For example, take Isshin Sword Saint, the final boss of Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. Here's a clip of his music. That is a very powerful opening to a boss fight, and it helps set the scene quite a bit. Another boss that does this well is the Hand of the King from Dead Cells. Here's a part of his song. The slow pacing and orchestral feel goes really well with the fight and has a great mood overall. Next up, we have the arena. A final boss's arena should have a very grand and very open scheme. Often it's nice for it to be outside on a cliff or in a cathedral with a vaulted ceiling or something. The arena itself doesn't have to be too big, but it should feel like you have a large space to work with. It should also be designed as a final location, so to speak. It should differ from previous areas encountered in the game, but follow the same general idea. A boss that does this quite well is the Soul of Cinder from Dark Souls 3. This is his arena, completely open along one side with a cliff face of twisted architecture on the other, and a general grand open scheme. Another boss that does this well would be the Radiance from Hollow Knight. The arches in the background with the other platforms makes it feel like you have a ton of space. And as a bonus, the arches are of similar design to the horns of the game's protagonist, making it a familiar design, but still very different from the rest of the game due to the bright colors. And lastly is the background. A general rule to follow for a background would be to either have a lot happening or very little. Take for example Isshin Sword Saint. You're gonna hear this boss referenced a lot, as it does many things quite well. The background starts off as just a dark sky. However, upon reaching his second phase, lightning bolts start striking the background, and storm clouds are appearing. Come the third phase, the lightning becomes much more frequent and chaotic, and the background has much going on. This also contributes to the general epic feel of the final boss. Whereas in contrast to this, Slave Knight Gale from Dark Souls 3 has a very bland background. There are some clouds and stuff, but they just stay pretty still, until the final phase when there's some lightning in the background. This lack of stuff in the background helps you focus on the design of the boss, and is very good when the boss is well designed. The second main thing that contributes to a good final boss is its design. I don't mean in terms of gameplay yet, that comes after this. I just mean appearance, dialogue, and its relation to the character. I'd consider some of these things to be the most important things to have in a final boss. First of all, there's the boss's appearance. In short, it should look cool. Obviously, appearance is subjective, so let me elaborate. Does this look like a final boss you'd want to fight? For most of you, that's probably a no. However, does this look like a boss you'd want to fight? How about this? And this? For me, yes. These bosses all have one thing in common. They have an interesting and fairly unique design that can be simply described as cool. If a boss looks like this, you're not going to want to fight it. It looks lame. It would probably have an attack where it falls on you or something. But if the boss looks like this, that looks cool as hell. It probably has an attack where it starts raining projectiles that you have to bounce off of while it flies across the screen, damaging you, and then chills on the side of the arena while you get to smack it up. Yeah, I rest my case. Next up is dialogue. Unfortunately, mid-boss dialogue isn't something I see too often, and it isn't what I'd consider a necessity, but it certainly improves the fight. The only example of this I can currently think of is Isshin Sword Saint. His fight begins with, "Come, Sekiro!" Upon reaching his second phase, he says his iconic, "How my blood boils! Face me, Sekiro!" This is something that just appeals to me, and I really enjoy. It gives me the sense that he's fighting me just as much as I'm fighting him. A sort of battle of two super powerful forces. Kinda like Operation Barbarossa. In general, I think this is something more final bosses need, and it certainly increases my overall enjoyment of a fight. Lastly, and in my opinion the most important thing for a final boss to have, strong relations to the protagonist. A final boss should be the antagonist for the majority of the game, or maybe an NPC that turns evil, or maybe a dying old man who gets summoned back from the underworld by his grandson's suicide so that he can kill you and take back his failing country. Good examples of this would be Slave Knight Gale, the man who helps you navigate through both Ariandel and the Ringed City in Dark Souls 3, and eventually he decides that you must die, so that he can take your dark soul. This provides a sense of shock when you realize that not only has your ally turned on you, but he's a really good fighter. Like, why didn't he use his cloak as a weapon when he helped you kill the demon princes? Like, come on, man. Another great example of this, and the best in my opinion, is Shriek from Ori and the Will of the Wisps. This boss is my favorite antagonist in any game I've played. She's terrifying and menacing throughout the entire game. And when you fight her, it's a huge climax that has been hyped up from the start. What more must I say? Now, there are also some bosses that do this pretty poorly. For one, the Hand of the King from Dead Cells. This guy has one single lore room in the entire game, and there's no other mention of him. To be fair, the game is a roguelike, so that is a little bit acceptable. And spoiler alert, he's not the true final boss. So let's give another bad example. The Messenger's final boss, Phantom. There's no mention of this guy the entire game, until at the very end when you learn who he is, and you go to save him from his curse. Once you finish his area, you fight him and stuff, and it's cool. But like, I only just learned who this guy was about 20 minutes ago, and I don't really care. This could have been improved upon if there were more references to him throughout the game, like people mentioning his name or something, to keep him mysterious until you learn about him, and it all clicks like, oh, so that's who they were talking about, or something. As you can tell, this was a large problem for me when finishing this game, so yeah, the final boss should be an established character. Alright, now for the juicy good stuff. The gameplay and the mechanics. This is what will decide whether a final boss is well designed, or well designed and super fun. There are a ton of possible things that could fall under gameplay and mechanics, so I chose the 4 that are the most important in my opinion. Those being the arena, the difficulty, the phases, and the moveset. Also, it should be worth noting that if your final boss is a gimmick boss, you deserve the death sentence. Starting up with the arena. Again, the arena itself highly depends on what kind of boss you're fighting and what kind of game you're playing. But in general, I think larger arenas are more fun for final bosses, as they allow you to focus on the boss and not running out of space in the arena. Some bosses may be better with smaller arenas, but I think the large areas are just generally better. There should also be some variation, perhaps rough terrain with some hills, maybe some rocks or trees, maybe some pillars or a staircase, but nothing that severely hinders the gameplay. The boss that does this well is Slave Knight Gale from Dark Souls 3. His arena is absolutely massive. Like seriously, when you start the fight, it takes the boss like a minute to run to you from where he spawns. But there are also a lot of hills and dunes in the area. Not to the point that it's hard to focus on the boss, but to the point that you can use him being up on a hill to your advantage. I should point out that 2D games are an obvious exception to this rule, as big arenas that go off screen suck for bosses. so a 2D game that does this well is The Last Sin of the Miracle from Blasphemous. The area is exactly one screen large, and there are platforms that spawn and alternate between different platform setups, which is quite useful for dodging fire and necessary for dealing damage to the boss without using all of your fervor on Debla of the Lights, though to be fair, you should be doing that anyways. Next up is difficulty. This is super important to me. Whether the game is hard like Dark Souls or easy like Will of the Wisps, the final boss should be challenging. I can think of no exception to this rule at all. Instead of providing you with specific evidence for 1 or 2 games, I'm going to list some hard final bosses and then some easy ones. For the hard ones, we got Slave Knight Gale, Isshin Sword Saint, Hand of the King, Shriek, and of course, Absolute Radiance. For the easy ones, we have Soul of Cinder, Last Son of the Miracle, Judgment, the Sealed Vessel / Hollow Knight, and Phantom. Bosses like Sword Saint, Gale, and Absolute Radiance are meant to be the final challenge, and they put up a good fight. You will spend a long time trying to beat the boss, and it will feel great when you finally do. However, for bosses like Judgment, Last Sun, and Soul of Cinder, they may take you a couple tries, or maybe some, Soul of Cinder and Last Sun, will only take you 1 try. And you'll be left with the feeling of, oh, that was a final boss? And it's far less of an accomplishment. Ah yes, it's time for the long debate about how many phases should a boss have. It's time I state my opinion on this. For a final boss, it's a no-brainer that 1 phase is too little. You kill it expecting another phase and you only get sadness and disappointment, like my parents when I was born. So a general rule of thumb is to at least have 2. 5 is what I consider to be the maximum, and if your boss has 5 phases, have at least one of them be super easy or an intro phase or an ad phase to get through unscathed. 3 is, in my opinion, the optimal amount of phases for a final boss. I should make it clear that when I say phases, I mean clear changes in the way a boss is fought. So for these purposes, Absolute Radiance has 4 phases, not 6. Last Son of the Miracle / His Holiness Escobar did a decent job at balancing the phases. However, His Holiness feels like a completely different boss than Last Son. He has his own health bar, and even though the attacks are similar, the way he's fought is not. I feel like you could have benefited from an extra phase in Last Son. A boss that does this pretty much perfectly, in my opinion, is, big surprise, Isshin Sword Saint. He has 4 phases total, technically. Every time you want to fight him, you have to kill Genichiro Way of Tomoe first, but he is a very quick and simple boss that you'll often get through unscathed. Then comes Isshin's first phase, super fun and epic. Second phase is hard, like really hard, but it's so cool and super fun. And then phase 3 is easy, but it's a really well balanced way to do a final boss. 4 phases, one of which is basically an ad phase. Very well done. Alright, the last point, and probably the hardest one to figure out, the moveset. Final boss's moveset should be vast. It should take a couple of attempts to memorize every attack, but it shouldn't be too overwhelming or it'll just be annoying. Also, if there's multiple variations of a move, I'd say max 3 variations. 2 is the optimal amount. But a moveset can't just be large. It needs to use many mechanics that have been taught to the player throughout the game. The final boss is the very end. If you learned a ton of mechanics and abilities and you only need to use like 3 of them on the final boss, it will feel anticlimactic. And of course, the moveset should change slightly between phases. Not too much or it'll ruin the flow of the fight, but enough to keep the player on their toes. I could go more in depth about how I think there should be at least one massive move that probably one-shots, takes a lot of brain power to dodge, and only happens every so often, or how they shouldn't be able to spam moves, or how bosses should have a long combo attack that's hard to dodge and decently damaging, but I think I just explained all that needs to be explained in that regards. So let's take a look at some well-designed movesets. Soul of Cinder from Dark Souls 3. This boss has a ton of attacks, enough that would normally be too overwhelming, but he has the mechanic of having multiple states in the first phase, each with its own moveset. And if I had died to him, it would have taken multiple attempts to learn for all of them. Additionally, in phase 2, he has a massive 5-hit combo that is fairly tough to dodge, and getting hit by all 5 will often result in death. Shriek from Ori and the Will of the Wisps. This boss uses bashing, climbing, grappling, launching, pretty much every other movement ability, and the option to use tons of combat abilities. The amount of attacks is fairly limited, but almost all of them use a specific mechanic learned throughout the game, and that is what I love about this fight. Phantom from The Messenger. I may have been a bit too harsh on this boss before. Despite having no relation to the protagonist whatsoever and being really easy, he's a fun fight. He makes use of the time travel very well with these cool laser things that use it, good use of Cloud Step and the rope dart, and a pretty decent amount of attacks. And now for some bosses with less cool movesets. Last Son of the Miracle. Despite how much I like this boss's design and lore, his fight is a bit of a letdown. He only has a few attacks, most are super easy to dodge, and they make use of almost none of his mechanics. No parrying, unless you can parry the sword, I don't know, I've never tried. No Fervorous Blood, no Weight of Sin, nothing. The only real mechanic is prayers, and by prayers I mean Debla of the Lights. Judgment. Despite being both really cool and really fun, this boss's moveset doesn't make use of any mechanics. It has a very scarce moveset, and it's quite easy to learn. That being said, I would not consider this a boss with a poorly designed moveset. I just think it missed out on some cool mechanics. And finally, it's time to create the criteria for my next video in 2028. After some intense number crunching, I have created this table to, hopefully, accurately give each final boss a ranking. In my next video, in 2028, we'll see how accurate this criteria is, and maybe I'll revamp it if it's bad. But for now, I think it'll work. I'll leave a link to the template in the description in case anyone wants to use it for some reason. Thank you for sitting and watching me ramble on about final boss fights for 15 minutes. I made this video really only because I wanted to create a definitive way to rank final bosses, and because I've been giving the idea a lot of thought and wanted to share it with people. If I missed anything or you disagree with something in this video, please do let me know in the comments. And hey, if you end up ranking a final boss with the criteria I created, send it to me on Discord or Twitter. Both of those will be linked in the description. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in 2028.